Welcome to Conversations with Life. This is going to be an interesting episode. This is going to be a conversation with death, because death and life are the conversation. And death turns out, in any spiritual path or any meaning path, turns out to be one of the most important elements. It seems kind of obvious to say it that way, but I think it's not realized by most people in middle world America who are trying to lead lives of meaning and maybe have a spiritual awakening, how much the energy of death, the idea of death, and how that comes in. And then also this dealing with sort of grief, and not just the grief of our physical life passing, but the grief of the many kinds of death that we experience. So that's our topic today, bright and shiny.
I love this topic, and I think it's pertinent on many levels because both of us have experienced some pretty intense kind of death initiation type containers recently. Specifically, Steve, you're sitting with your mother on her deathbed right now, and that's been a really beautiful and interesting experience.
Yeah, and for sure, the passing of a parent, I think, even if that parent isn't, it's not like she's young or that her health has been good lately, so this isn't like a surprise, But to work with the death of a parent is interesting, I'm finding, because there's so much of your personality and process that's tied up in your parents. So to see one's parents die, I think, is a natural part of the consciousness container, right? So we have to experience it. In a normal life, you'll experience the death of at least your grandparents and probably your parents. And you'll get to experience the passing away of the previous generations. And that does something. There's a humanness to that. There's something that is very meaningful and significant and kind of wonderful. Not like, oh, sure glad you're dead. But, like, wow.
Full of wonder.
It's full of wonder. Yeah. I'm learning so much about myself in this process.
Well, and I think one reason, particularly in Western culture, it's such a big deal is that our culture tries so hard to avoid death. A lot of the things that we do just from day to day life are in avoidance of some kind of threat of losing livelihood, losing significance. Even the way that we do our death ceremonies in the West are kind of weird. I think it's pretty distorted to take a dead body that could easily and healthily return to the earth and pump it up with a bunch of chemicals to make it still seem alive.
Right. I mean,
and
it's preservation, right? Like if you took a body that was only a few days gone and buried it, it would still look the same as if you pumped it full of embalming fluid. The point of the embalming fluid is to slow down the decomposition process. But why? I say to them all the time, like, okay, when I go, put me in a pine box and just put me in the ground. If that doesn't work, or if you're not happy with that, then burn me, burlap sack, peach tree, and just bury it. Like, just plant the tree somewhere and that'll be good. Like, that's what I want. Just like make it the easiest possible for me to just be gone.
And I think there's a style in that, or an idea in that I think is really honoring, like, this idea that we can just go with it, Everything is dying all the time and we're going to die. And one of the things that happens in the material world in life is that we seem to be fighting that thing. We seem to be fighting. We have ourselves opposed to death rather than having actually what I feel is that there is death in us all the time. There's death energy working in us all the time. And I'll explain that a little bit more later. But just to the wider point is this kind of like idea, like why and what constitutes a good death? What helps us to understand our life more, our personal meaning process? How do we die gracefully, and how does that inform even our daily living?
And I think a huge theme that I hope to kind of pass in this podcast today is that your resistance to death is your resistance to life. And it's probably creating a lot of the suffering that you're experiencing in day-to-day living.
Well, I wonder too, like, what's the fascination with trying to have a nice death or an honorable death? Like, birth isn't like pretty or gentle, you know, like, I mean, I know it's a lot worse than it really should be with modern medicine, but I mean, it's traumatic for the baby. Like, it's a big deal, you know, like it's an expulsion, right? So why do we think death should be chill and we should just be, okay, I'm going and off I go in the most dignified way possible? I'm like, I expect to go out the way I came in. Naked, screaming, and doing something cool. Like, that's how I should just be. Like, I don't know.
That's so funny.
Well, and that's the thing is, what's your definition of graceful or beautiful? And I think what you just described, Keith, is such a testament to the raw aliveness that's possible, not just with birth and not just with death, but in every moment as we sort of take on the template and the practice of being with the process that we're in all the time, which is a perpetual death and rebirth experience.
And it kind of goes to this kind of psychological idea that we resist things, right? So we think by losing ourselves, by losing things, by losing identities, by losing, money, by losing our whatever, our titles, our sanity, we think by losing things, we're going to lose, right? It's going to be bad. But the real pain is not losing them, right? Like, there's a lot of people who say, well, we're going to figure out the human life cycle and we're going to make people live forever. We're going to make people live for 200 years even. I'm like, oh, hell no. I don't think we were made to live forever. I think that's a terrible, terrible idea. Just from the side of consciousness, going with the theme that the purpose of life is consciousness. Death is the best. I want to get old. I want to die. And, I want to not resist it. What I see is people think that by holding on to things, by holding on to concepts, people, all the things, we suffer way more than if we just learn that nothing's permanent. It goes and we go with it. We accept it when it comes, right? There's another thing, accepting life as it is, opening up to life. But to really do that, you have to make room with letting go of things.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have all your energy tied up in holding on rather than just being in it.
We talked about it's like the idea of radical acceptance and accepting every piece as it comes. And I feel like not just in life and death, but even in everything, like you're saying, the job or the title or the image of yourself, the ego, holding on to your identifiers to the point where you don't want to lose it, you don't want it to die. And then because of that, you strangle it anyway.
Yeah.
And it dies a bloody death instead of a graceful one.
Yeah. So, the attitudes towards death and our feelings in the death process and being around it are very much our feelings about life. That's what we're doing. We're dying as much as we're living. And it has to be that way. However, we are here, so we're on the side of life. Some people say there was a war in heaven. Some Christians say there was a war in heaven. And that 2/3 of the spirits were like, yeah, let's go to earth. And one of them thirds like, that's not a good idea. That's terrible. I don't like your plan or whatever, right? And I think that's about a human life. I think we have about 2/3 life and about 1/3 death. But that 1/3 death is very important. What happens sometimes in life is that people get negated. I call this people's perversity or our personal Satan. And I think this is what we projected on the outside as Satan. So I think this perversity is really important to listen to. It's really important to listen to us because there's something in us that's like, you shouldn't be here forever, buddy. So after a certain time, your body's going to break down. After a certain time, your mind's going to break down. You're going to go away. You're going to start going away. And I think the only reason that happens is because of this perverse part. And, I think that's a good thing. In theology, for instance, Satan is necessary. Anti-life forces are necessary. If we didn't have anti-life forces, nothing would mean anything, you know?
Right. I mean, without death, there is no real life, right? Like, if it was just infinite and there were no consequences, you could do whatever the hell you wanted.
And dumb. Yet we don't want to give in to death too much, right? So if that 1/3 or whatever, you know, do the math, whatever part of death is, I think I'm like 4/5 death myself. But like, if we give into that piece too much, then we start to have thoughts of ending it early, for instance. Or we start negating ourselves in subconscious ways. We start making sure that we don't succeed. We start making sure that our relationships will fail. We start making sure that our health will be terrible. We start to do these things that are perverse. And we wonder why, right? And there's this balance, this life-death balance. You know, I'm on the side of life and I'm on the side of death, right? Like both are true. But life a little bit more, because I'm here. I'm not going to argue with life, right? I want to open up to life, but I don't want to argue with death, you know? And I think that's a kind of an important place to be.
The nature of life is change. One of the things that keeps happening to me is things I learned from the scriptures in my really religious days come back to me with a different light. You know, I've played with that a lot in my contemplations and even in some of the poetry that I've written about the graven image is the holding on to something too long. And, you know, if you want to say that God and life are the same thing, that when you make a graven image of God, you're actually taking away the life and the nature of God. And so, but we do that. We do that with our identities. You know, we land on something that gives us just the right amount of superiority or dopamine hit or whatever, and we attach to it, we identify with it, we see ourselves that way, and then we go into this distortion of needing to convince everybody else to see us that way. And we really can make a graven image or an idol of ourselves that we are then putting all of our resource, consciousness, effort into maintaining. And what we essentially do is cut off the life force and become a sepulcher, become a statue. And then what we did is we missed out on the life that was happening. And the change that was happening because we weren't willing to be with it and look at it.
I like that. I like that image. Faint, so to speak.
Let's hold on to that. Now, one of my epic poems was inspired partially by seeing a poppy growing in a sidewalk crack in downtown Salt Lake. Just, it made me laugh out loud at how, you know, life pushes through all these many efforts that we do to try to stop it or control it. And that was really meaningful for me to feel that. Like, okay, the flowers are going to push through no matter what I try to do to encapsulate who I am. So what if I just be with the life part?
So I'd like to take a few teachings of death. Some of these might be obvious, right? So just what are some of the teachings of death? And one of the things I think that death really teaches, like, is it distills life. So when, like, it focuses life, right? So if
I mean, it gives you an alternative, right? A consequence. So then, you know, the fear of death, either what I've found, either distills life, like you're saying, either focuses it, or it makes it so that you're so afraid you can do nothing.
Yeah. So when we're too on the side of death, we shut down.
Right.
Right. And, you know, it's really interesting, like as a teacher, when you have a student speak in front of the class and say that's not something they want to do, it can feel like a death for them to stand up in front of their peers. It is like a death. They're kicking and screaming. They really feel like they're going to be attacked, like something's going to go wrong, right? Because somewhere they got the message that they're not okay, you know? And so being exposed in front of your peers feels like too big of a threat. like emotionally. It's like to them, like if you were on a high wire over a Great Canyon, you know, but really it's just kind of like wide plank, you know. And, you know, that's what I would, my practice would do. And I would literally say these words. I'd have the students go get, you know, read some short thing to kind of warm up to the time they were supposed to give a speech. And then they would sit down, especially the ones that were really nervous. And there's always 2 or 3 in the class that were so nervous that they you know, they
can't do anything.
Literally in a death stare, kind of up there, you know. And so I would say, go up there, do whatever. And then they would sit down and I'd say, guess what? You didn't die. And they're like, what do you know? You know? Some of them were like, yeah, I did die. This was a death. Didn't see the death up there? So, you know, it's interesting. Death focuses and distills life. There's something about it that makes the time we have here unpredictable. I could die any moment. And that possibility makes every moment a little more sharp. Until I lose track of that, we do all sorts of things in life to try to lose track of the fact that we could die any moment. We try to create all sorts of safety around us that's really not there, or the illusion of safety, right? Which has the effect in the Western world, unfortunately, of making us very unfocused. We don't live, I don't think, as rich as we could if we had more death practice or more death attunement. So yeah, anyway, anybody have a thinking about that? Death as a focuser.
This is the problem, I think, with not just me, but with Western culture, right? And one thing that the LDS church kind of, I think, made better for me, which is not a lot of things, but death and fear are so, like, permanently attached in my mind, right? Or at least they were. And the celebration of death that we see actually a lot in Eastern culture and in the LDS culture, there's more of that than there is in, say, Catholic, for example, right? The Catholic faith that I was part of beforehand, death was awful and this horrible thing or whatever. They're so connected, and sometimes fear is a focuser and sometimes fear blurs everything. And so I'm having a really hard time separating death and fear. Like, how does death focus me if not through fear, right? Because I don't have, like, death with hope. Like, that's not a thing I have right now. And I don't have, like, you know, death with peace. I just think, like, if I die, everyone who's under this roof is just fucked. Like, I'm just like, I have all the information. I have, like, the majority of the money. Like, everybody's fucked, you know? And, like, my life insurance just ain't going to cut it, right? So I think for me, it's when I'm less afraid, I feel more focused. Or if I'm afraid in the right way, I feel more focused. And whether that's fear of death or fear of not being able to provide as a husband and a father or whatever, fear can act as a focuser and it can be a distorter. So I'm how do we separate fear and death? Because we do live in this Western culture where death is terrifying.
And we've talked a little bit about that as far as like nervous systems and regulation and that kind of thing. And I think coming back to that, when that part of your brain is activated where your body thinks that your life is in danger, your brain acts differently. And in some ways it can create focus, but it's usually focused towards a pretty primal act, such as fighting or running away or hiding. And in our culture, all 3 of those things are usually not going to be that helpful when you feel afraid.
Right.
So that's one thing to just, you know, put in the pool of consideration. Like, okay, well, physiologically even, we have fear mechanisms that we are trying to evolve out of because we don't live in a prey-predator situation most of the time.
Right.
The old technology would say that fear is good, and we invented all sorts of stories about the afterlife to assuage our fears. You know, oh, you'll live forever with your family. Oh, you're going to go to a better place. Oh, Nirvana, Elysian Fields, whatever. The Greeks were actually pretty bad on death. A lot of these cultures, these old cultures, death was a terrible, terrible place, you know. At least the Greeks, you could only spend, 7 years in Hades, but it was hell. I mean, pure, like, torture the whole time.
Yeah.
And a few people eventually got to go to the Elysian Fields, a few heroes, whatever. Most people, they wouldn't suffer, then their soul would be recycled. And other cultures have just as bleak a view. And so, that would be very good for population control. It'd be very good to make people afraid of death from the standpoint if you were trying to control a population. So I think that's what a lot of was going on in those kind of early civilization theologies. But I think the Buddhists have a really beautiful take on death. And they also have a lot of death practice, a lot of death meditation. You know, so you sit, the Bardo practice, you sit and you imagine what it isn't like to be, you know, what it's like to be not, you know, you just sit in your own death energy. And that's a really lovely thing because you kind of connect with the energy of not existence. That's awesome. But on the other side, this basic trust idea is I trust life so much that death happens in life and I know it. And I'm not going to bother. What is it anyway? There's something about fear and death, right, that are hooked up in the culture. They're played on in movies. They're played on in entertainment. That creates instant tension when there's a threat. We have very few examples of people actually meeting it with like
Grace.
Ease and grace. The truth of life is that life figures itself
They'll
out.
figure it out.
And I'm not saying that it's going to be pretty, but life is often not pretty.
Yeah.
And my being or not being there for my kids both have medicine.
Well, and maybe part of what's there for you even, and probably for all of us, is we're more afraid of not being important than we are of not existing. And that might be a contemplation to sit with, because really, even at a physical level, death is just a change. It's just a transformation. Nothing's actually disappearing. Things are simply just changing into something else.
Right.
It kind of blends to the next idea in that everything is energy and everything is connected. So people talk about astrology and they doubt it, but like all we're talking about is big energy patterns. So we could talk about grand energy patterns and how they affect physiology and psychology. Every single thing in this world is connected. Everything from the beginning of time to the end of time, if that even exists, or if either exists, right?
Right.
Every single life form and energy is in a cause and effect and complex symbiotic relationship, right?
Uh-huh.
So I trust that life knows what it's doing, that God knows what it's doing, whatever God is. The idea there is the more we lean into that trust, the more that me being here or not being here is just what it is. Mm-hmm. And the day of my death, in a way, is known. Time is an illusion. Like, I'll come, I'll go. I know this, right? A guy I used to know said, death rate in America is 1 per person. And, you don't get out of this thing alive. You don't. And I'll come and go, and that experience will be what it was. And some days I've had many in which I'm like, I'd rather not be here. Do I need to stay here? Oh. Like, every single person, who's the philosopher that like they said the whole philosophy is whether we should commit suicide or not. There was a philosopher that said the whole of philosophy boils down to whether or not, really the only question of philosophy is, should we kill ourselves? And, my answer to that is a solid no, because I trust life. It happens like it happens,
Is that Camus?
Yeah, I think it's Camus.
Yeah, Camus. Okay.
And yeah, this is Camus. And, I trust it enough that I respect other people's decisions, but I really feel like we should give life the benefit of the doubt because we are here.
Yeah.
Like we're something. We're here, not here.
I said this very thing, right? So I had a friend come over the other day in just the pits of it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, suicidal thoughts every day, but like this was, had to actually beat the black dog off with a stick, right? And he comes in and he's like, well, I just feel like it'd be easier. I'm like, how the hell would you don't fucking know what it's going to be. Mm. I'm like, this is the only fucking thing you know. Mm-hmm. And if you're right, and there's a heaven, for example, you're going to be there really upset with yourself that you just pieced out on everyone you love and they're all left devastated. And if you're wrong, you're going to be nothingness in the nothing. Like there's nothing there. So at best, you're going to hate yourself more than you do now, man. Like, what are you running to? And he was like, well, even nothing is better than this. I'm like, no, nothing's better than nothing. It's nothing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is nothing that nothing could be better than. And he's just sitting there looking at me like I'm speaking French. And I'm like, how is this a thing that we're thinking about right now? But it is. Like hundreds of thousands of people thinking about and stressing about and contemplating and doing every single day is the how do we call it now? Does Gen Z say it? Unaliving themselves, right?
Unaliving themselves.
And asking themselves that question every day. And I think to myself, like, I never considered it a blessing that suicide wasn't on the table for me. Like, it was just never an option. And it's just never one that, like, even came up organically. That's as far as I go. Like, I want to be out of here. You know, and just like, but it is, like, for a lot of people, and I feel like I don't know what the composition of the mind is that leads some people to ask this question so much more than others, and whether it's more fear or less fear or more despair or less hope or whatever. But for some people, it's the only question is, am I going to get through today? And I don't understand it at all. And maybe that means I'm a little bit more than 4/5 life or whatever, right? I'm like somehow 6/5 life. Yeah. Like I'm like an improper fraction of life. Like I don't even know. I'm somehow a mixed numeral, like whatever. And I count myself very lucky for that, because I live with people and I see people and I teach people who ask this question every day. And I had a student my second year of teaching in America who answered that question in the worst possible way. Right? And it was awful, you know? And it's like, how do we separate, or how do we reconcile that the primal fear of death, and some people almost have a primal longing for death, and then how do I separate my, like, just inextricable grief when it happens, right? Like, you know, trusting life and trusting the process and trusting their choices, you know, but a student unalives himself and I almost didn't go back. Like I was done, you know, and my grandfather passed away about a year ago back in Australia. Couldn't go see him, couldn't, like, you know, wasn't there at all for him, and it was devastating. And I'm like, how do I trust life enough to trust death?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've been on quite a roller coaster with this myself, experiencing particularly some really intense postpartum periods where there was a lot of intrusive thoughts, and then some experiences just in the last couple of years where the amount of faith I had that things could get better was almost not enough to pull me through what I felt like life was requiring of me. And I think that's a big part of why death feels so horrifying, is that it's unknown. We have no brain structures to propel us forward with, like, oh, this is what might happen. And that's what our minds are used to doing. They're used to taking all of our past experiences and conglomerating them together so that we have a sense that when we take an action, a certain thing is going to happen.
Right.
And especially when you leave some of the mythology of structured religion and you don't have that, you know, myth or fantasy anymore to rely on, it can get pretty heavy to just be like, well, I just don't know. So, you know, how do we get comfortable with not knowing? And I have a kind of funny story about that, because I thought I was pretty good at it. The first couple of years of my spiritual journey, I definitely went through the spiritual ego phase, and stuff was going really good. I had a great job. I had great relationships, new friendships. I wasn't feeling burdened by all the restrictions of the religion, and things were just amazing. And so I was like, oh, this is what life is like, you know? And then I encountered some things that took me into my darker parts. And during one of these transformational containers, we were spending a lot of time on the land. And so I had this little place in the woods that I would go visit quite regularly as a part of this mystery school training I was doing. And I would just sit and contemplate and be with the plants and animals, and really wanted to get to this place where, like, okay, I can just be out in nature and not be afraid for my life. I wish I could overcome this fear, you know? And so I go out there on this winter day, and by the time I hiked to the spot, it was kind of warm, so I hung my coat on a branch and, you know, just started communing with nature. Not once, not twice, but 3 times I turned around and my coat was standing there like a person, and I completely freaked out.
Yikes.
To the point where by the 3rd time, I just burst into tears, like, I'm never going to be able to overcome this fear.
Put your coat on the floor, so that was like
an important moment for me, that, like, I couldn't I couldn't mind over matter myself out of
Right.
the very visceral, primal sense of danger that my system is always looking for, to the point that turning around in a coat hanging there.
Every time.
It's so interesting, you know, being more, I guess you could say, like naturally like life. Yeah. And we've talked about spirit and soul, and these are kind of these patterns. Soul people are more naturally attuned to the body and death. Spirit people are more naturally attuned to transcendence, and things don't seem as hard for them until they are, right? Until you realize that no amount of optimism can deal with the fact that we're going to die. And especially when somebody around you dies, or you lose really bad, or you lose your reputation, your name, or you lose money, or you lose friends, or you lose a marriage, or you lose, all those things, which, I've all lost. And, none of those things are really there. I don't know why, but there's some people, and I think these people generally end up being therapists or shamans or whatever, that are closer to death. In the villages, they had this really interesting tradition in, tribal societies. Several of them have this similar kind of thing happen, where somebody in the village, some kid, would have the death dream. They would be torn apart. They'd be dismembered, right?
Okay.
Yeah, they had this dismemberment dream. And when the child had the dismemberment dream, that was going to be the next shaman. Because for some reason there was death in the field of that child, and that made them uniquely suited to be shaman. And they would leave the normal processes of life. They would leave their home. They'd be co-trained, in the woods or on the hill where the shaman lived, where nobody wanted to go, where, the fence with bones on it and stuff. I'm picturing. I don't know. But that was a big part of how they would see who was going to be in that role. And I found myself in this role in life. I work trauma. I talk to a lot of people who want to kill themselves. It's my specialty. It's like I seem to find the people who are going through a huge death or suicidal ideation or something where they've just been absolutely wrecked to the point. Something in me understands that really well. And it's not a knowledge thing. It's just my system was built that. I for whatever reason, when I came, how I came, as I came to the world, I felt like the world didn't understand me. So I was not met with attunement and understanding.
Sure.
Well, you didn't have an elder to take you out of the processes of life. I think it's really, really important that you said those words, suicidal ideation, etc., is that the people who do have that sensitivity to death still have to carry on with the normal processes of life. And it feels dishonoring. Well,
in my case, I was just bewildered, right? Like I call my childhood just bewilderment. I have no idea. I don't fit in. I'm standing by the wall watching the kids play. I'm not in for some reason. I have no idea why I'm not included, And that's just all of life. I'm easy target for bullies. I'm almost backwards to everybody else. So I developed something like opposite of a living human, And it took me a long time to figure this out. When I taught school, the number one comment I got the first day of school, or maybe the first week of school, was, "I thought you hated me." Barfus I can, right? And even then, the students would say over and over again, "Mr. Barfus, I just thought you hated me. I thought you were a jerk. I just got this from you that, and I'm like, sorry, I call it my anti-charisma, and I have something that pokes at people. It's a death sense or something, that can be very, very useful once you survive it, but then the students would come to me later, and the ones I would jive with, the students I would connect with, were the ones like me. There was always 3 or 4. It was the poets.
Yep.
It was the emos. It was the kids who were gay and didn't feel okay with their family. It was the atheist kids who didn't, and they were going to die, or they were having a hard time holding themselves in this world.
Yeah.
And, I got to see them. On the other hand, some of the kids who are on the other side of things really connected with me because they're like, "You're the first one who felt like class was meaningful. This felt meaningful. This felt really rich." If they would dive in,
they felt the life.
If I could connect, they could feel the life in it. Mm-hmm. It was a really interesting thing. And then, some kids just thought I hated them the whole time. And
I
never did. Well,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit.
Maybe, but even like, I get that. I get that sometimes too. The energy that someone's picking up from me is not even remotely what I'm putting down, and I'm like, this is just weird. I'm really good at giving you what you need, energy wise. This is actually probably one of the things I'm most critical of myself about, the chameleon nature of like my energy, right? Like this is why I can get along with narcissists.
Yeah.
It's why I can get along with, people who are self-deprecating or have very low self-esteem, because I just am really good at like, oh, I see what you need. I'll be that for you right now. But there's always a couple of kids who just never really click or jive and understand authenticity. And only when I just stop trying completely, like I'm like, whatever, I don't give a shit if you like me, suddenly we're homies, suddenly we're best friends. And those seem like the same kids who are attuned to that thing, this like, attuned to death, if you will. And it requires the death of like my need to be liked before they're even willing to let me
Because they
in.
can sense that from if someone comes at me
Yeah.
with that energy, like needing to be liked. I'm like, like my whole system, like, right? I can't stand it. Never have been able to, and church was rough for me that way. Because it's like, all these assholes here trying to get me to like them, and trying to make me a nice person. I call it perversity. Some people have a lot of perversity in them, and I have a lot of perversity in me. Not that I'm pervert or that I try to do things anti-life. It's just I was built around kind of an opposite way. I always felt just so opposite and odd to most of the things that people are. Now, turns out a lot of people are like that, right? And so when I did get to connect to people, I would stop being afraid. I would connect to the kids, usually the other sufferers, and that's to this day. Me and the sufferers, we all get along pretty well. I can do pretty well now also with the spirit people. I can connect, but that's kind of new in my life. It's really just fascinating. The whole death thing, perversity thing, our relationship to it constructs a lot of our basic personality, I think.
Well, I want to riff off of Keith's thing a little because I feel like we share that kind of people pleaser, caretaker, chameleon thing. And I almost feel like I developed that as a mask, as a survival, because underneath that is something that's very attuned to death.
Interesting.
And so it was almost like a way to protect not just myself, but everyone else from my dark. And what has been interesting for me since starting to do some of my shadow work and dive into that is those normal life processes, they feel offensive now. And it almost feels, when I'm put in a situation where I have to behave outside of my authenticity now, it almost feels like I'm going back to my old abuser. And it's funny because we had this experience this week where I launched the podcast wrong. But part of what I was experiencing in that was this very thing we're talking about. And so I want to presence it because it's like a really current experience for me, is that I have been in this death portal since, our most recent training that Steve and I did a couple weeks ago. And then a week later, he goes into this portal with his mom. And because we're closely connected, we're kind of, working those energies together. And so when the time came to like do a thing on Facebook to like promote my business, like I couldn't really access that part of myself.
Right.
But I was like making myself do it. And so I did it really poorly. I totally forgot the plan. And it was, I know it all worked out, but it was a really important process for me to see myself, is that I actually went against what my soul was doing. I went away from the process my soul was in because I was afraid of disappointing, or not being on track or whatever.
Before we end, I want to spend a little bit of time on grief as an attunement of death.
Yeah.
So grief in our culture is a very bad thing. And we try to not be seen as grieving, right?
I mean, literally, like black veils and, like that's like, you wear dark colors, you hide your face. You like literally grief is like shameful. Almost,
the way we do it.
do it.
Any big expression of emotion is a let go of the mask or identity, and it's too real, and that just leads into it. But, kind of what better held grief is, I think, one of the keys to living a good life. It's letting ourselves feel the loss. It's letting ourselves feel the pain of the anti-life forces in our life, when we've been put down, when we've been disrespected, when we lose money or face, relationship, when we lose things, when parts of us go away. And parts of these things can be very valuable. When children leave, Boaz just left home, this week. And every time I look over at his room, I want to cry.
Yeah.
Because I love that kid, And there's something about letting ourselves feel these losses and express that grief, to really release it, to honor it. It's not like, oh no, poor me. It's, I love things.
Yeah.
I'm alive in this world in a really beautiful way. And if I'm going to be open and alive to things, I'm going to feel the loss of things.
And drastically, I mean, I had almost the opposite experience as a kid. I didn't cry for shit. Like, it was not a thing. And, it was mostly because it wasn't like an okay thing. Like, boys don't cry, and toughen up and be a man, and and
I had
what
the
are
same
you doing?
thing, but I did anyway. I just felt terrible about myself.
I don't know. I was not as authentic. No, it's where that thing started, right? Like, where I became what I needed to be for somebody else, and so like I didn't feel like, if I could help it, I didn't, right? And so, I lost 2 grandparents as a kid, and they were overseas as well. It should have been devastating. And I just sort of rolled with it. When you don't allow yourself, or when you're not allowed to experience grief, to hold it, because it's not even like to dwell in it, but to literally hold it and say this, like, to change that meaning and be like, yeah, I'm so sad that this person is gone from my life, because life was greater and now is less without them, right? And to hold that when you don't, and you don't allow yourself to, every emotion is number. Every emotion is less. And so, like, you get less angry, you get less sad, you get less happy, you get less joyful, you get less giddy. And then, funnily enough, because you're repressing everything, you actually end up getting more angry.
Yeah.
And you get better at hiding who you are. And you turn around at 34 years old and go, who the fuck is this guy? Because you've never allowed yourself to be authentic. And so when you're talking about, allowing grief and holding grief, and, it being not just acceptable, but almost should be celebrated.
Yeah.
Like, the fact that we can feel grief means we are in life.
Grief is a celebration of love, Because if I didn't love, I would not hurt.
Exactly. And that's when you repress grief, you repress love.
Yeah.
Totally.
And you aren't able to love fully because you're too afraid. And so if you're not willing to grieve, you're really, even subconsciously, not willing to love. Because you know that increased love is going to increase grief. And it's just one of those things, like, even thinking about it right now, like, there's so much I want to go back and say to the people that I have lost. And so much time that I want to open and bring them in closer to me that I just forgoed, because it was safer to just, be stoic.
Yeah. And the thing about heartbreak is, like Cedar says, it's a celebration of love, but it's also an expansion.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to more love and more life. And so, being in a place where you can maybe soften around the sensation of grief, and even imagine your heart bursting or tearing. Sometimes it feels like a tearing,
Yeah.
And it will take you by surprise for sometimes years after the event, to be with that sensation, so that in that process you actually also get to experience the growth of your heart, your greater capacity for love and life becomes richer.
And it's about, not just about people we lose, but it's about everything we lose. For instance, losing a marriage is just as sad as losing a loved one. I lost my whole identity We had the whole Barfus family thing going, right? And I still grieve that from time to time, that kind of unit that we were, the team we were, you know? And I don't think that marriage should still be a thing, you know? Even though I value Gina in my life, I want to be married to her. And it's not honoring for us to be married, really. But there's still an identity there. This goes with all the old Steves, all the old egos, all the old identities that I had, you know, Mr. Barfus. I grieve that guy sometimes. When school starts, I'm mostly happy I'm not there. But there's part of me, to let all that go is sad, because I love those guys, you know. I love those versions. And, you know, being gone from them is really, to let anything go is really, you know, you need that time. But I find that grief is the pathway back to love. You know, I like what you said there, Keith. Like, it ties me back to it. I get to feel it. Therefore, I get to realize what it was that I liked, and that continually gets to be alive in me. Not that I need to go around, you know, crying the whole time or mourning the whole time. I mean, I cry a lot these days, but it's probably not appropriate all the time.
Well, I think you can identify with the perversity or the grief, and in that sense you actually like just loop the thing back on yourself. Be present, drop into your body, what's happening right now, and be with it and let it move through you, because it's always going to change.
You can go like too far to the other side where you're like wearing black all the time and I'm dark.
Right, but there's also like, how do you throw yourself into the next marriage or relationship, or how do you throw yourself into the next job or the next love if you haven't grieved the loss of the one before? Like, really, you know, I have definitely avoided grief a lot in my life, and I'm thinking about those times right now, and I'm sitting here like, am I as present as I could be in these relationships, in this part of my life right now, this change part of my life, if I haven't really grieved the things I've lost? Right? And like, what does real grief look like? Because for me, it doesn't look like weeping or crying or on the floor and, you know, breaking things, but, you know, can look like so many things. It can look like hyperactivity. It can look like depression. It can look like disassociation. There are so many ways that grief can manifest. And I feel like we talk about depression and getting sad and wearing black and stuff as something that you don't want to get trapped in, but there's such an honor in allowing that to just not be shameful. There's nothing shameful about depression. It's just your body forcing you to slow down, think, and honor and respect and hold and cherish the thing that you lost.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important that we don't have to do grief. It's a natural process. We just need to open to it.
Right.
And whatever you're opening.
Allow it.
Yeah, opening to it. And it's heartbreak. It's opening ourselves big enough to allow that these things cannot be, and we still can be. Right. I can live in a world, even though I love big, I can live in a world where I lose the things I love, because ultimately what I love and what I'm interested in is life. I'm here. I'm doing this, regardless of what's around me and what I have and what I don't have. When we talk about death, we talk about acceptance, but acceptance is misunderstood. It's a powerful energy. It's not a passive thing. It's very energetically robust.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like the way that acceptance has been presented to us is almost the same as repression.
Not retreat. What am I thinking of? Like giving up. You know, like sacrifice or
depletion.
Like acceptance is seen as like, well, now just stop fighting. And it's like, no, I fight in my acceptance too.
You know, some of the most worth effort is some of these negative energies or these negative processes, you know, like grief, like acceptance, like death, you know. It takes, you know, it's a natural process. It's a natural thing. It's going to happen. But there's this holding ourselves in it.
Yeah, and being with it versus feeling like you have to somehow show up or carry on or act like it hasn't changed you. I know that that's a thing that I've had to heal in myself. And so many times a tragic thing has happened to me and I've just accepted it and moved on and gotten a lot of, you know, praise or whatever for that. But I've I've had to go back and reckon. And
Right.
actually feel that grief.
Because you're not, maybe like for me, when I do that, when I just accept it and move on, it's not really acceptance so much as it's like resignation and like repression.
Yeah.
Like I repressed it and moved on. And
One
this
more thing to say. I just want to just honor my mom in her death process. And I just want to say, wherever you're listening from, Mom, by the time this airs, I think you'll probably be past. Hope this reaches you out there somewhere. Just honoring the life and the death of a beautiful woman, but a beautiful person and a good soul. And to also, I think, teach me so much about life and death and her living and dying process. And just so much honor to her. So I'll end with that.
Such a poignant time to do an episode on death.
It's big in my field, part of the game. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. We'd love to hear what you have to say. We'd love to make this more relevant and more useful to you. We want to keep this an authentic journey for all of us. So we'd love to hear from you.